In 2008, Europe was 90% the size of the US economy, but today it is reduced to just 65%. Germany is now in recession, and the Eurozone slipped into technical recession in the first 3 months of the year. It is declining at a share of world GDP, overtaken by China and in the future perhaps India. The euro has already fallen 33% in the past decade as investors become more pessimistic. But could this gradual decline keep getting worse until nobody cares anymore? Let's look at the role of tight budgets, the Ukraine war, and an aging population, and also find out why economic statistics can give a misleading impression. Europe made great progress during the 1980s and was a model of stability and economic growth. But this has changed in recent years. COVID and skyrocketing gas prices made an already weak market even more unstable. But one of the biggest barriers to growth in Europe has been an obsession with reducing debt, especially in Germany. Since the euro debt crisis of 2010, the EU has prioritized reducing fiscal deficits, which has led to lower economic growth. But an unfortunate consequence of this has been a failure to reduce debt to GDP ratios. Italy's debt soared despite efforts to reduce borrowing. This is because slower economic growth leads to lower tax revenue, which leads to rising budget deficits and more pressure for austerity. Italy is symbolic of Europe's economic stagnation, with one of the worst wage growth rates in the world. Tough times and the effects of weak economic growth have been magnified by long-term demographic factors. The European population is aging fast, and this is slowing down investment and productivity growth. In previous decades, the growing number of older people didn't hurt the economy as much because more women entered the workforce, and many migrated from other countries. But now people aren't happy about migrating. Also, Europe is aging at a faster rate than ever before. Europe has a chronically low birth rate, and with housing costs going through the roof, there's going to be no easy solution to this. Another problem of an aging population is that it puts further pressure on government spending. European economies already pay a very high share of GDP on pensions, but the demographic pressures we see are only going to put more pressure on raising taxes. It is Germany's economic slowdown which is most worrying. German industries in particular complain about a burden of regulation. It takes 120 days for a German firm to receive an operating license, while Italy and Greece only takes 40 days. 5G adoption is much lower in Europe than the rest of the world, and it hasn't quite caught up in the super-fast world of big tech. The global growth sector has been dominated by the US and Asia, while European companies seem stuck, unable to adapt quickly enough to join this booming industry. The EU is sought to take on big tech with policies like GDPR, but this is another example of a regulatory burden which has placed costs on business, especially small and medium-sized firms, and not the big tech giants, which was the goal of a regulation. Years ago, Germany chose to get rid of nuclear power and buy cheap gas from Russia. This choice is making things harder now. The shock rise in gas prices in 2022 was very damaging for both German industry and the wider European economy. One problem is, Europe relies too much on the imported American gas. This makes them heavily dependent on other nations. In the US, the recent inflation was mainly due to a strong economy and rising demand. But in Europe, it was mainly due to rising energy prices, which is why Europe ended up with the worst of both worlds: high inflation and falling growth. In the US, President Biden's ambitious program of subsidies for renewables led to a surge in American growth and investment in manufacturing. Meanwhile, it's hard for the EU to do major spending projects like the US because it's difficult to find agreement amongst the member states, and they don't always get along. Initially, when the euro was adopted, it led to a wave of happiness, as consumers and firms enjoyed frictionless trade and consumption. Countries in the South borrowed to fund consumption from the North, but this initial happiness masked a growing divergence, with Southern economies becoming uncompetitive and running large deficits. Since 2008, the euro has highlighted the decline of prospects for the European economy. It reflects a fall in economic growth and the stagnation of economic prospects. Now, it is important to bear in mind that the problems faced by Europe are not unique. Japan, the US, and even China have all seen slowdown to economic growth compared to previous decades. The post-war period was a unique opportunity with transforming technologies, a rise in labor market participation, and the baby boomer generation. And many of these advantages are just no more, so growth becomes harder for everybody. While it is true that the European economy has definitely struggled compared to America, it is important to bear in mind a bigger picture. Firstly, the US has a higher GDP per capita, but it is also true that the US works 15% longer hours. In the case of Germany, Americans work 35% more hours per year. The EU mandates a minimum of 20 days paid leave per year, whereas the US has a federal minimum of 0. American workers may be better paid, but European workers have a better work-life balance. In dollar terms, EU productivity has fallen behind the US, but if we use purchasing power parity, which takes into account local prices, EU productivity has actually exceeded the US. And if we use purchasing power parity rather than dollar terms, the relative difference in performance is not quite as bad. Yet Europe is still growing slower than America, whichever method you use. In particular, the demographic challenge is a real problem for Europe because it is so acute and has so many potential problems, which if not looked into could cause a major crisis for Europe.